India's economic growth is running a relay race to reach the $5 trillion mark and become the world's third largest economy within this decade. Recently crossing the hurdle of a global pandemic with a V shaped recovery expected later this year, India's economy could pick up the pace on the back of rising domestic consumption and a boost to its domestic manufacturing prowess, which now attracts the world's best brands. Digital transformation is also being embraced across both private and public sectors, opening new ways of doing business and enacting policy efficiently to benefit citizens. And that's just the preview. If this is truly the decade of opportunity, what does that mean for the Indian investor? That's what we are here to find out. I'm your host, Gautam Srinivasan, and with me is Maneesh Dangi, the CIO of Fixed Income at Aditya Birla Sun Life AMC, to share his insights on the topic. Manish, great to have you with us. It's a wide-ranging topic, and I'm sure we have lots of points to cover. But as always, when it comes to India, the headline news is always projected growth rates, right? Every day we see new projections coming about. The IMF recently projected 11.5% growth rate for India this year. I recently read a report that OECD is projecting a 12.6% or 12.7% growth rate. So if we go by the relay race analogy with, say, liberalization as the first stage and digitalization as the second stage, is India's domestic manufacturing story going to be the sort of third stage, which helps it sprint towards becoming the world's third largest economy, considering the sustained high growth needed for the next 5 years to reach that goal?
Thanks, Gautam. A pleasure to be sort of talking to you. Our own estimate, of course, is more optimistic than that of OECD, and we've stuck to this for a couple of quarters now that we would most probably grow at 13% next year. But it's an interesting question that you pose in terms of in a relay race analogy. I like to personally see India. I mean, if I were to see the evolution of our economic system, we actually moved from, I would say, somewhat of a feudal society pre-independence, which was essentially an exploitation raj of British, to just after independence for a couple of decades, sort of a planning, socialistic, bureaucratic, remember those license raj days, set up. And that sort of continued until beginning 80s, and its time had come to sort of give into something else, and which was free market economy. So in a sense, evolution has been over last 30 years, you are moving from less of a planning stroke socialistic or bureaucratic system to more of a free market economy, where most asset allocation, most capital decisions are actually based on what markets thinks instead of what IAS officers think. So most businesses when you were growing up were actually run by government, okay, and now most businesses are run by entrepreneurs in India now. So in a sense, that's the sort of a transformation which has taken place, at least from a historical standpoint. Now, I mean, while you make this point that digitalization was the second stage, perhaps it's fair to say that digitalization is the fourth industrial revolution playing out in front of us, and to a certain extent, in India's case, we're not as primitive as in terms of industrialization. We were somewhat primitive, and for very long we remained an agrarian economy. In digitalization, we've moved up the curve faster than what our per capita would suggest, So to that extent, I think we've sort of culled some bit of an extra in digitalization. But you're right that domestic manufacturing, would play a pivotal role in building India to the dream of most of us, that we want it to be one of the largest economy in nominal terms, not the PPP terms only. We are already, by the way, very big in PPP, purchasing power parity terms. Okay, so in a summary, I would like to believe, Gautam, is that while manufacturing is important to build an industrial economy, and so is infrastructure, but when, as an investor, I look around, what I see is that there are low hanging fruits almost every place.
Hmm.
A consumption of everything relative to even an emerging market is super low.
Hmm.
Our capital stock, the amount of money locked in building, manufacturing, or other stuff, is very, very low.
Hmm.
So, in some sense, the project that we have in front of us for my generation and next is to build India in
Hmm.
almost all dimension. We need to build houses for people. We need to build world class transport. Some of it that has happened, but a lot has to be achieved.
Hmm.
We have to transform our finance from a finance which works only for elites and the 10 percenters to an average Indian.
Hmm.
And we have to move from a collateral based lending in finance to a cash flow based lending. We need to improve our education and healthcare system. So, so many areas where a dramatic improvement would actually, in my view, can take place and will take place. And that would keep us in good stead, at least for next couple of decades. And I think we'll do very well.
So do you think, it could give rise to an India growth model which could be replicated the world over? Because it's always been the case that India, has been seen as replicating a particular model to grow. It was unique in a sense that, the mixture of public and private sector, which worked for India, and eventually it's going more towards the private sector base. So do you think there is that India growth model which could be replicated the world over? And also in terms of core strength, what would you see as remaining the same and what would you see as changing?
So, in terms of developmental model, we ought to choose. There are. I mean, we chose, let's say, post independence. We chose something called uh, planning model, okay, and where the state would play key role in building a country. But that system, we now know in hindsight, did not work well, not just in India but across the world. And with USSR's failing to a very large extent, that option is not there on the table. So what we have on table right now is a free market a business model or a economic developmental model, which is what is practiced by most of the OECD countries, okay, developed countries of the sorts. And the other model is a little bit of an Asia model, I would say. To a large extent, you could call it a China model as well, but to a certain extent, majority of the other Asian economies, including Japan and Korea, by the way, actually followed, and which is a bit of a top-down authoritarian capitalism, where state actually uh, plays a significant role in society, asset allocation, building businesses, capital allocation, and so on and so forth. Now, this is not like a USSR model where state actually runs factories, but state, in some sense, for lack of any other word, colludes
Influences, you could say
enterprise.
influences, right?
Yeah,
But
something.
that's the question here, because Indians see the tiger economies which emerged, right? And we wonder when are we going to be the tiger economy where we have sustained growth rates of, let's say, 12-13% over, let's say, a decade, which finally pushes India to the big league. Because right now there's always that talk of potential, right? Sure, in the periods in the middle, maybe we'll have a double-digit growth rate for the year, but it's always that, the engine, just when the gear is supposed to go up, let's say to the fourth gear or fifth gear, we come back down to the third gear or the second gear. So that impatience is what people are wondering as to, will things change now? Do you think that will be the case, that we will go into high gear now?
So, I mean, 12-13% growth that we briefly saw in Japan, and for good 2 decades, 10% plus growth in China. I mean, that's not going to happen in our country. We know this because that requires far too many boxes to be ticked, which perhaps is not possible in a democratic federal setup, And by the way, most of the West did not grow on the back of 10, 12, 13% growth, In good times, all these industrial economies were growing at 4, 5%. So to that extent, I don't think that's likely to happen. What's likely to happen, though, is that firstly, let's sort of take a stock of what has happened in last couple of years. In a sense, last 25 years also, we've done reasonably well. Again, if you compare this with with China and some of the other Asian economies, in the wonder years, they were doing far better than what India has been able to put together, okay, in terms of growth rate. But yet, with respect to our own history, your dad's generation actually perhaps saw zero growth throughout the generation in per capita terms. But, my generation has experienced sort of a 6.5% of a per capita growth over the last 25, 30 years. Okay. That's a good deal, I would say. We've been, remarkably resilient, in a sense, in the end, it's going to be about trade-off that would I want a China-like setup and have another 2-3% growth? Many of the elites would say that, yes, that, it makes sense for to have democracy and, grow what Gurucharan Das used to talk about. Grow a little lesser, but many others would choose otherwise. But that choice is not on the table. We are a democratic setup, and there are limits to which reforms can be undertaken, because remember that reforms invariably have some or other people getting hurt. Okay, so the ideas of Pareto improvement in terms of there is no way that you can reform an economy without hurting a section of people. And so to that extent, it's a extremely argumentative democratic process that we follow, and which actually slows us down. And that's not a constraint for Taiwan and China and many other relatively more authoritarian states, so to say. Okay. So okay. I mean, to cut this short, 12%, 11% is not on the table. Nonetheless, what's on table, Gautam, is that historically we've done a reasonable job. 6.5% is akin to a miracle economy. Had China not happened, we would have been celebrated as one.
We would have had a better frame of reference. I think that's where people have gotten spoiled in terms of expectations, where they expect double-digit growths to continue throughout the decade, and then you can claim that, hey, we took millions out of poverty, and this is the economic miracle that you have all been waiting for. Fair point that India has its own growth story, but in terms of pointing out the top 3 strengths, what are the top 3 strengths? Because then, as per that, I lead on to the next question then.
Yeah. So, see, the biggest strength, of course, is, and which has not changed, okay, that we have a growing labor force. We are low income and low debt economy. So our household isn't much levered, and therefore no crisis, including a crisis like COVID, does not result in major scarring, okay? And so to that extent, hysteresis does not play out in India as much as it does in economies where households are extremely levered. Okay, we're also a very large country, reasonable level of literacy. Incrementally, all people entering the workforce now are literate. We've had a reasonable good talent pool, Gautam. In a sense that even when a generation before, also we had a reasonable talent pool. All of them leaving the country, to work for Western industrial empires is different, but we've had a reasonable talent pool. Again, not because, we are genetically better off. It's just that the law of large numbers, right? If you have 100...
It's a fair point, but again, it's the same problem which, say, China faces, right? We have a great large talent pool and low wages, which attracts businesses to come set up businesses here. But as the curve evolves, wages go up, people look for other opportunities, and then the question of you versus the international competition comes up, because they're also building the same capabilities or they already have them. So how does India position itself well here? I understand your points about, low leverage definitely works for us, because from a debt perspective, things are still manageable. We're not as leveraged as some of the developed economies are. So from a purely economist perspective, that's fine. But when you come to the large talent pool and low wage question, the idea is we have other economies as well, which are trying to do the same. So how does India stay competitive there?
So you're right that, some of these things have not changed, and which produced 6.5% return growth for us. Okay. But why am I somewhat more optimistic on India's story today than what I have been for the last couple of years is because, and again, I'll try and answer the questions in terms of placing India vis-a-vis rest of the other industrial countries, who are competing with us. I think the good news, which I we've seen are one or two things. One is that structural level, I'll try and debate with you, as to why I think, India can put on more growth, okay, in its thali than what we are used to, which is 6.5%. It's because, we've undertaken some serious reforms, okay. India has had a reasonable tradition of reforming itself, especially after late mid 80s, okay. Initially, as I said, from planned economy to free market economy, when we moved, we dismantled license Raj, opened up Indian economy for both trade and capital by reducing tariffs and liberalizing FDI. Then early 2000, we sort of started to improve our infrastructure, which is ongoing. DFCs and such things are game changer, which perhaps would drive more infrastructure improvement. But then all of that has resulted in just 6.5% growth. The elusive 9-10% growth. How do you get that? Is what I'm really happy to sort of, everyone knows this, of course, but I'm trying to put together a framework that some of the reforms, Gautam, which have been undertaken by India in last couple of years, and everyone knows about them, that, reforms with respect to, we've built a reasonable amount of digital infrastructure, including identity, each Indian today you can recognize, and that's a game changer, as you and I know. GST has made India as one market finally, So in a sense today, the scale that GST provides today, because of converting Indian fragmented market into one market, could be humongous, but its benefits will unfold as we move forward. IBC, of course, which is the bankruptcy code, has led to some sort of a management reform, that today as a lender, when I lend to someone, and if I don't like the management because it's not up to the mark, I can change the management. Okay. So that is what IBC does. Again, a big reform. Agri reforms are likely to unshackle the agri market, and make them more open. And finally, the tax cuts of last year, duty regime of last 3-4 years, along with PLIs, that we should discuss maybe in detail, I can fire up investment in India. And finally, I think something which has been a taboo for Indian policymakers, privatization, now is being pushed even in areas where government had monopoly, defense, space, atomic energy, coal. All of these were actually monopolies of government, and a lot of inefficiencies had crept in there. I think government is now, at least ideologically, if you've heard Mr. Modi and some of the ministers, coming out quite open, unabashedly betting for privatization. So a lot of these change, along with, stuff like new education policy, again, because I'm interested in education, I think is a game changer. Electricity distribution is being privatized. Again, it's sort of a game changer in areas where we've been very sticky and the productivity growth has been low. Okay? So, in a sense, we are becoming relatively more reformed, transparent economy. Think of something like, I was seeing a data on FASTag today. NHI would collect about 65-70 crore in FY19 on an average in similar month, and we are collecting now 100 crores. Right? In Feb, the number was per day number of collection is 100 crore. That actually basically tells you that, there was a lot of chori happening there, right? But it sort of transparently improves the efficiency of road operators. GST has made trade transparent. We are likely to see 130,000 crore of GST collection versus, less than 100,000 crore 2 years ago. So again, dramatic improvement. DBT has made government transfers transparent. And because of CIBIL, the credit has become, rule-based and transparent. So a lot of changes, Gautam.
So in a way, these are antibiotics, right? To break the fever, these are medicines which were required, as you're saying, right? When we look at DBT, helps save a lot of leakage. When you look at one market, GST helps up in scaling. IBC reform, long needed, and the tax cuts and the performance linked initiatives. Privatization, as you mentioned, is something which is of big focus. But the question is time on our side? My biggest worry when I think about this is that are these the things which should have happened some time ago, and the tailwinds now helping us move forward, or do we still have the tailwinds which could push us? Maybe not now, as you mentioned, right? GST, when the scheme got implemented, we always used to hear stories of, collection is low, is this working? Then gradually collections started picking up. And as you mentioned, even for NHAI, right? Initially, there was the question of will these collections actually matter? That's gradually when the data starts showing collections going up that people come around. The question is, okay, now that you've bought into it, do we still have time to properly make sure that India's economy is on the right track, or is it that the international competition is just moving at a far too fast pace versus India that we might have actually missed out on the opportunity? What's your thought on that?
No, so brilliant point actually. And I mean, the way I like to think of this, Gautam, is I think COVID has put some time on our clock, okay? Because what COVID has done is that somehow today the West, I mean, most of the developed countries see China as adversary. And as you and I know, the Indo-Pacific is increasingly has become sort of a place where what Middle East to a certain extent was and Europe was in last 100 years, at different point in time. Indo-Pacific has become extremely pivotal to Western economies in terms of strategic thinking. And China is considered an adversary. Now, why am I bringing geopolitics here is there are a lot of strategic implications that, we're not debating them here. But even from an economic standpoint, because China is now seen as chief competition to US and pretty much the whole of West, I would say, I think there is an opportunity opening up for India, which is relatively a more liberal democratic setup, to get plugged into Western systems.
Okay.
And benefit from this China plus one strategy that most of the capital supply chains, firms, businesses are looking to sort of diversify their supply chain primarily based out of China to other countries. Okay. So you're right that had COVID-19 or trade war between US and China and this whole trap which is being laid out in front of us, that perhaps in next 50, 100 years, there's going to be major competition between these two powers. I think, it is somehow lubricating us as a country. It's up to us. It's not given, by the way. It's up to us.
We need to make use of that opportunity.
We have to absolutely be able to benefit from this. It's just that I think that the international setting has never been as good for India as it is today. Okay. And I'm not talking about economy, okay, that, economy, world growth will be about a percentage more for next 2-3 years. You're actually asking me over next many years and perhaps decades, how could we do better than what we've done? And I think outside of our own reforms and the vibrance that we see in our economy within our system, which is endogenous, what has changed, of course, is also something exogenous to us, which is, the framework that we all operate in. Okay. So I think, that too will facilitate our growth. Again, the government, let's understand this, that it's important that, while let's say Apple wants to follow a China plus one policy, but then would Apple come to us or Vietnam? Okay? That decision is not a given.
It's not as clear cut.
You have to tick many boxes, you have to be able to put together a framework of something like PLI, which ensures that when Apple produces something here, it's competitive. You should be able to put together all the factors of production, government should be able to give away land. It should be able to cut taxes to levels which are competitive so that, Apple feels like coming and setting up a factory here. Okay. Labor should be talent, there should be skilling of the labor which is made available to Apple so that, it can think of hiring a reasonable quality labor from Indian markets. So all of these are to be done things, The good news is that a lot of these things are part of, the narrative that we hear from the government.
Okay.
One is an unabashedly pro-privatization and somewhat liberal government, which believes in market forces instead of building India itself, unlike China and ASEAN's, but also, in some sense, pro-enterprise government and ready to do that extra mile thing to ensure that, when people relocate businesses from China in the current geopolitical setting, India ticks all the boxes, be it ease of doing business, be it low taxes, be it reasonable infrastructure, good talent, and so on and so forth. The good news, Gautam, is that, some of the boxes are being ticked. And so to that extent, it's the first time I believe that there is a bit of a all of government approach being undertaken
Okay.
to entice, what do you call it, the businesses. And the last bit, which is a little bit of a macro thing, is that when I say all of the government, think of even RBI intervening in currency markets and absorbing almost 130, $40 billion over last 1 year, but not letting the currency appreciate because of the burden of large flow is exactly pointing at all of government approach, that every time when the large BOP surplus leads to large amount of money flowing in our setup, we allow our currency to appreciate meaningfully, and therefore our advantage vis-a-vis many other sort of competing industrial nations, actually we lose out there. So I think this time around, at least, even RBI is following this sort of principle of ensuring that our currency does not become too expensive for our exporters.
So it is looking at the broad economy and making sure that the steps are in consonance with the idea that growth is paramount, but it is also meaningful growth. But in that context, right, as you mentioned, if you've got a pro-market government, you've got the RBI falling in line in terms of rates, you've got India in a prime position to capitalize the opportunity which comes the way of China +1. All right, that's a wrap on the first part of this conversation with Maneesh Dangi on the India growth story. And we'll be back with the second part of this conversation, focusing more on the opportunities and the advantage that the Indian investor can take from the India growth story.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.